It's very rare that the Torah will tell us a story and then tell us the lesson we're supposed to learn from the story. That's usually in Torah Shabbal Peh. Yet in this week's parasha, we're going to get the second lesson out of the story of Nadav and Avihu. The only thing is, it's a long way off from when we were given the first lesson. The question is why? And it's because the Torah is addressing two audiences. One unusual factor about the story of Nadav and Avihu's passing is the fact that the Torah gives us practical lessons to learn from their story. We know, generally speaking, every part of Torah is there to teach us a lesson in how we should conduct ourselves. That's what Torah is for. That's actually what the word Torah means. An expression of instruction. Torah is there to give us instructions. But the vast majority of stories and even concepts that are shared in Torah Shabbal Peh, we usually have to consult Torah Shabbal Peh to extract what is the practical lesson from the story, or the pasuk, or the word, or from the pasuk of the word, etc. Here's an exception. In our story, Nadav and Avihu, state in Chumash Gufa, in the Chumash, in Torah Shabbal, it tells us, that as a result of the passing of Aaron's two sons, there were two mitzvahs, two instructions that emerged from it. The first was back in Parashat Shmini Aleph. Do not drink intoxicating liquids before you enter to serve in the Mishkan or later the Beis Hamikdash. Rashi tells us in his commentary, and if Rashi is telling us then it's obviously the simplest understanding of the pasuk. As the Acharei gesagt geworden, gleich noch Mrs. Nadav Avihu, Rashi tells us, why was this instruction given immediately after the story of Nadav and Avihu passing away? Because they obviously entered the Mishkan intoxicated, and so immediately we have the lesson, don't repeat that. Then the one that's closer to home for us is the instruction at the beginning of our parsha, which is Hashem spoke to Moshe after the passing of Aaron's two sons because they came close to Hashem. And he says, speak to Aaron your brother and tell him, and by extension the Kohanim, do not enter into the holy space at any time of your choosing. In other words, there's a designated time, Yom Kippur. Outside of that, don't go there. So Rashi shows us the connection between the fact that it's after Nadav and Avihu passed away to the instruction where Aaron and the Kohanim should not enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim whenever they please. As dosis v'aroife, Rashi says it's like a doctor who, if he could use a recent stark example, it's much more effective than just giving a theoretical instruction. The way you rarely get a patient to comply is you say, I don't want you to, God forbid, die like so-and-so did because they followed this particular behavior. Translate that into our story. Why did Nadav and Avihu pass away prematurely? Because they came close to Hashem inappropriately and therefore they died. As the pasuk clearly says in Shmini, they entered in a way that they were not instructed to do. So therefore, straight after that, Aaron is instructed, Acharei in that context of the passing of his two sons, don't enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim at will. As Rashi says, in order that you and the Kohanim don't chas v'shalom pass away like Nadav and Avihu did. Okay, so we get it. Two lessons. Don't be intoxicated. Don't go into the Beis Hamikdash at the wrong times. But there is a big distinction between these two lessons from the story of Nadav and Avihu and the two instructions that accompany them. The prohibition against serving while intoxicated is stated immediately in Parashat Shmini, immediately after the story of Nadav and Avihu passing away. In fact, it's such a compelling issue that the Torah temporarily stops talking about the other instructions which were relevant for that day to inaugurate the Mishkan, to tell us something which wasn't relevant specifically to that day. It's actually relevant going forward. Don't be intoxicated. So it's immediately, straight after the story. But the instruction not to enter the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan, the Kodesh HaKadoshim whenever you want, that only arrives in Parshas Acharei. And between the story of the passing of Nadav and Avihu and this instruction, there's a gap, and it's a big gap. From Berch 2.5 sedras, it's pretty much 2.5 parashas, and different topics. The laws of kosher animals, birds, and fish. Then all the laws of purity and impurity associated with nida and zav and zava and birth and tsaras. And after all of that, which seems completely off the topic, then the Eibush addresses the other lesson from Nadav and Avihu: don't enter the Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan, the Kodesh Kodashim, whenever you wish. Okay, before we can answer that, let's first understand why Acharei Mos is placed where it is placed. The logic why Parshas Acharei Mos belongs after Shmini, which told us about kosher and non-kosher animals, birds and fish, and after all the laws of purity and impurity which were discussed in the twin Parshas Tazrium and Tzorah. We can explain clearly why Acharei Mos comes after that, as das is beseder from Mamal Lamata be'hemshach to Parshas Shmini. It's a flow starting from Parshas Shmini, actually in a way of descending spiritual levels. What does that mean? The Teichen Kloli from the Mesh and Tel from Parshas Acharei is, let's remind ourselves, what's the whole first part of Parshas Acharei Mos about? The Seder Avodah for Yom HaKippurim. It's the order of the service on Yom Kippur, which is Vasinyon is Kishmoy Kapara, a day of, as we all know, atonement. The pasuk tells us this is the day that will atone and purify you from all your averos. The other pasuk in Acharei Mos tells us there's one day of the calendar year allocated to cleansing all of our averos. Averos that need to be attended to is obviously a pretty low spiritual state. On der Fall ist der Torah macht in Torah Sabema v'ha'oiv gomer und die Dine Tumah von Parshas Tazrium und Tzorah far Parshas Acharei. What belongs even before you get there is the laws of how you conduct yourself with animals, birds, and fish, and how you conduct yourself internally. In other words, in the Seder's Biz Parshas Shmini, let's look at the order of Torah from Matan Torah, basically. What were the parashas before Shmini? Retzech Bike Wegen Inyonim, was seinen Shaykh zu Kedusha. It's pretty much focused on topics that are holy topics. We have the instructions how to build the Mishkan. This is after Matan Torah, right? Then you have the parashas about how to make the uniforms for the Kehanim. Und then noch Parashas Korbanos. Then you have the description of what you're supposed to do to serve Hashem with Korbanos in the Mishkan. Welche Mizmakriv and Mishkan and Mikdash brought in the holy spaces of the Mishkan and Mikdash. On them after the general principle of how that's all done, then you have the order of how they initiated the Mishkan, which brings us to Parashas Shmini, which was the 8th day after 7 days of preparation to actually start service in the Mishkan. So all of that, from Parashas Truma until Parashas Shmini, is focused on completely holy elements. Now we're going to step after that out of the Mishkan and start looking at how a Jew is supposed to engage the world. Now we're no longer in the world of pristine Kedusha. We're in a place where there is a mixture of positive and negative, good and bad. And as the pasuk tells us at the end of Parashas Shmini, the guidance and light of Torah will help us to distinguish between the things that are impure and the things that are impure. Torah will guide us to be able to achieve what we should spiritually and avoid things that are spiritually unhealthy. So now that we understand this principle, first you've got all the parashas that speak about pure holiness, and then the parashas that speak about engaging the world appropriately. Now you can understand the comment of Chazal, which Rashi quotes also in Parashas Tazria, just like when the Eibishter created the world, he created humans after all the other creatures. So the laws which relate to humans are given after the laws about animals, fish, and birds. Now, that doesn't seem to make sense, because how could you suggest? Who's suggesting of it that Parashas Tazrium and Tzorah is the first time that we're getting the instructions for how a human should behave? What do you mean? Earlier, prior to that, there are loads of different instructions given to the Jewish people, and not just side issues, core issues. Like the Ten Commandments. Haseder Sheshma is Parashas Mishpotim. V'oid, a whole parsha dedicated to Mishpatim. Is that not Torah Sa'adam? So what are Chazal telling us? That Torah Sa'adam is only given after Torah Sa'behema. What do you mean? Some of the most important parts of Torah Sa'adam surely were given before. Now the bir in them is, it's more subtle than you think. Die Protein Pirusho und der Chiddush von der Torah Hira bestetin lahavdil ben atome ben ator gomer. From the end of Parsha Shmini, we are focused on a very specific area of halacha, which is to be able to distinguish between that which is holy and unholy. Und der Rebbe is Pirusha von Torah Shel Adam. In that context, when we speak about Torah Shel Adam, what we mean is the Torah nit b'shaychas an hagas Adam bichlal. We're not talking about the general guidance that the Torah gives us on how to be a Jewish person. No, b'shaychas inyone tuma was werden neudet von Guf ha'adam atzmoi. Have a look in Parshas Tazria Metzora. We're talking about the possibility of a human being creating from their own self, their own anatomy, something that makes them tummy. Yoiledes, childbirth, tzaras, zov, chulei, all various forms of impurity that come from the body. Was die Torah is mehr weist und lernt dem Modem, wie es darf sein, die lahavdem und gehört zu den Jonen, welche seinen in Emalem, bitzirosai. So Torah Sa'adam over here doesn't mean how to be a Jewish person. It means the guidance from Torah, how to deal with the parts of ourselves that could generate impurity. How to manage that. Gufa kommt die Parsha wegen Avodas Yom Kippurim es noch Torahs Behema Chai V'Oif, which helps us to understand why Parshas Acharei, which is about Yom Kippur, belongs after we've spoken about humans producing tumah. Weil der Uftu von Yom Kippurim is Negea Beker es noch di dinim, because you only really need a Yom Kippur once you've reached this part of the spiritual journey. As long as you're in the world of Kedusha, you don't need a Yom Kippur. But once you're engaged in the world which has the potential of treif animals, or the potential of human tumah, now you need a Yom Kippur. Nachdem wie Torah sagt on die Heroes Saiden, wenn hat es dann mit Inyone Ha'olam. Once the Torah in Parsha Shmini, second half, and in Tazria Metzora, has given the Jewish person guidance on how to engage the world with its pitfalls, was der Pfarrer darf sich aussitten von die Dvorenbilte Ritzuyim, that's why the person has to be warned. Avoid this, avoid that, it's unhealthy. Lahavde ben atome ben ator, know how to distinguish between that which is impure and that which is pure. But Aharon Torah, the Torah is going to say, you know what, we know what's going to happen. As a Zovis is meglech, as a Itzach has schon durchfallen. We know that it's possible that a Jew will slip. Und es soll sein, zum Zukleppen von die Dvorenbilte Ritzuyim Shaboilam, and maybe will attract to himself some of the unhealthy energy of this world by engaging in places and things we shouldn't have. Soll es sich nicht mehr sein, chas v'sholem. Don't despair. Was ist da der Achas? After you've seen what the perils are of Shmini, Tazria, Metzora, you get reassured. There's an Acharei. Don't worry. Once a year, there'll be a Yom Kippur. It will help you cleanse if you got into the wrong places. So that explains why Acharei follows after Tazria and Metzora and after Shmini. It does not explain why the lessons from Nadav and Avihu get split across two parashas, but it sets the tone for us to understand this. Aber das nicht kann wir maßbek auf dem, was die Torah wart mit dem Tziva, weil Yove b'chol Eisel HaKodesh, bis Parshas Acharei. This hasn't yet satisfied why the Torah delayed the second lesson from Nadav and Avihu all the way to Parshas Acharei. For Mafapia, as Dinim von Yom Kippurim is verbunden mit Torahs Behema Chai V'Oif und Torah Shel Adam. Yes, Yom Kippur is to help us recover from inappropriate interactions, either with the physical world represented by the animals or the internal world represented by Tumah. But the specific instruction over here, not to enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim inappropriately, in order that the Kohen is protected not to die like Nadav and Avihu did. And the logical place to discuss it would have been straight after Nadav and Avihu passed away, especially like Rashi said. You want the doctor to use the most compelling argument, which is while the story is still fresh in your mind. And even if you want to say, look, the instruction was given to Aharon and his sons immediately, which is logical. Unless it's not and it was only written in a non-chronological order later on in Torah, which happens because the Torah is not always in consequential order. But because we know that every single detail in Torah is so precise, is mestaber to sagen, and then it's logical to conclude as das was the Torah stellt im Siva val Yava goyim da, the fact that the Torah wrote this instruction, even if it was said earlier, specifically at this point in time, must be is as nit nur weil der Siva val Yava goyim shach Yom Kippurim as reingehen ala kodesh ton nit sein b'cholei is not blows Yom Kippurim. It's not only because well now we're going to be talking about Yom Kippur, and you need to know you can't go into the kodesh HaKadoshim any other time, only on Yom Kippur. That's not the reason. Und der Union von Yom Kippurim darf stehen in dem Ort in Torah. And the discussion about Yom Kippur, as we've explained, has to be only after Shmini and Taz Yom Hatzorah. Nor euch mitzadem tziv val yavei gomer gufa. But there's got to be something about this instruction. Don't rush into the Kodesh HaKadoshim inappropriately that belongs here. As in Neutigkeit in the Bavonish val yavu chales la Kodesh heifach an hoga shnei bnei Aharon. That warning, don't behave like Aaron's sons did, and hold yourself back not to run into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Ve'beikar noch die parshas from Torah's behema chai va'oy from Torah shel Adam belongs here specifically. After we have spoken about the possibility of impurity, either through the world animals or through the self tumah. So what does that mean? Shlomo der Erklärung in dem. Well, in order to understand it, let's understand the deeper meaning, as many of us are familiar with. What did Nadav and Avihu do wrong? Everybody acknowledges that the sin of Nadav and Avihu was not a classical sin. Now, but rather, if you look in the Orach Chaim, it goes into tremendous detail about this. Zachet is bashanan in them, they lack, because chet also means lack. Was they haben they lost as a größer Weikes zum Eibischen soll sie zubringen zu Klois HaNefesh befeuern. What they did wrong is they allowed their tremendous yearning for Hashem to become overpowering to the extent that it caused Klois HaNefesh, where a person's soul zaps out of their body. And that's the implication of the pasuk. But korvasam lifnei Hashem, they came so close to Hashem, bizas vayomos, to the extent that they died, which means the neshama left their body, which sounds like a really spiritually positive thing, but isn't exactly what you're supposed to do. On dos is by zei farechen gevorm fayachet. For them, at their caliber, with their awareness, that was considered a sin. Even though it's completely appropriate to have the aspiration that my dedication to Hashem and my service of Hashem should be so profound that all I want to do is strip away the physical, sich auszuton von Gashmis, get rid of the materialistic, and then connect to Hashem spiritually. The Torah has a different expectation from us. When a person is edging into that space of Klois HaNefesh, the neshama is about to expire because of overriding inspiration, Rotzoi, as we call it, that yearning towards Hashem. What we're supposed to do is elicit from ourselves an anchor, bring ourselves back. Nicht herausgehen vom Welt. The objective is not to escape the world, nor zurückkehren sich zu tun seiner Avodah, was ist Avodah seiner Neshama beguf. We have to keep reminding ourselves and focus ourselves that we have to re-engage the world, because the purpose is to serve Hashem in physical terms, in Olam Hazeh, in this world. Like the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us, we live against our will. Maybe our will is to expire, to have a spiritual experience, but that's not what the Eibishter expects from us. Our responsibility is to fulfill Hashem's goal, which was to have a home in the lowest realm, specifically to machen von der Welt Gufa that our world should become the Eibishter's home. Now, there are two possible reasons why a person might have this issue of wishing to escape the world. Seine Franz hepechtige Sibis was der Frieden zu stehen hat nur von Rotzei onashev. There are two possible and actually completely opposite drivers that might cause a Jewish person to want to escape the world and leave the spirit, the physical behind. Sich oiston in ganzen von Gashmis, to completely strip away the physical. Aleph, the most logical is the Herrendik der Flow von Göttlichkeit. If a person is conscious of the incredible greatness and power of the Eibishter, to paraphrase the Orach Chaim, the neimus arevus mesikos, the fact that it's so pleasant, it's so beautiful, it's so sweet to sein Dovek and Eibishter, to be to cleave to Hashem. If a person feels that overwhelming joy and beauty, they'll do everything in their power to achieve it. And they'll invest every fiber of their being to get close to Hashem, to the extent that they actually are willing to leave this world, where literally the person could escape the physical world and have Klois HaNefesh. So that's one possible reason. They're gunning so high, they're so aware, they're so inspired that they're almost like being sucked out of their body. But there's another possibility, base. Mitzadim zweiten Kotz, on the opposite extreme. A person feels that this world is just so limiting and lowly. Und das bringt ihn zu entläufen, und vernehmen sich mit Dvorim Gashmi. And therefore I want to get away from all engagement with the physical as far as I can. Was kann ihm der Weiteren von Olam HaKedusha? Because I know that this world is just going to drag me down and distance me from the world of Kedusha. Bis als der Entläufen, der führt, als soll sich äußern im Ganzen von Gashmi zu Olam on Ashoib. And therefore that this person is going to feel so desperate that I have to escape the clutches of the physical world because it's destroying me, that they go to the opposite extreme and say, leave the world behind completely. Now, generally speaking, these issues would speak to two different communities in the Jewish world. This basically speaks to those who are 24/7 in yeshiva versus those who are engaged in business. By Yoshev Oil, a person who is fully in yeshiva, this is a person who is consumed only by Torah learning and doesn't have the stresses of earning a living. That person, you don't have to explain to them that the world is a really lowly, limiting place and you've got to get away from it. This person is in a spiritual environment. They're in the world of Torah. They're not consumed by physicality. So therefore, bei ihm darf ein Beike bei Wohner soll nicht machen kein Cheshben, als denen von Rotzi fordert sich mit Torah ad Ktzei Acharon. That person, you have to ensure that they don't believe that engagement in Torah has to be so extreme that it literally, so to speak, overwhelms a person, that pulls you out of this world completely. Because they'll tell us, Torah is something which really is completely beyond this world. So a person could say, look, if I really want to engage Torah properly, I have to escape the world because Torah is way beyond the world and the world's going to just be ballast. I need to let go of it in order to completely engage in Torah. And therefore the person might convince themselves that they need to just be in this yearning, upward, mobile state. Is to completely ignore the physical, completely ignore the body, and just keep climbing and climbing spiritually, because that will give me access to the true truth of Torah, the absolute core of Torah. So the Torah says, Torah warns him, as Adrab, to the contrary. You really want to capture the truth of Torah? Then your Torah learning has to translate back into shoiv. Means neshama beguf dafka, it has to translate back into something practical that engages the neshama while in a body. First of all, it means my brain, physical, human brain, has to be able to grasp the Torah. To the extent, like the Gemara tells us, that the Torah has to actually imbue all of my anatomy, not just the brain. Why is that? Because Torah is not reserved for the heavenly realm. To the contrary, as the famous debate between Moshe and the angels, Torah was specifically designed for and given into the physical realm. And that's so real. As we have various examples in Chazal, that in the Beis Din Shamayla, the great supernal yeshiva has to come find out from the earthly reality what the halach is. Because where is Torah truly? In this world. So escaping the world to gain Torah doesn't work. You'll say, okay, that's the practical part of Torah. What about the spiritual part of Torah? The concept that Torah is in our world is not only about the revealed elements of Torah like halacha. Obviously, that's to relate to the physical. Obviously, the halachas are very tangible. They're about oxen that gore sheep, go cows, and about people who break windows. And obviously, in the highest spiritual worlds, none of that is relevant. So therefore, it makes sense. And in that context, you've got to come down to hear what the physical Beis Din has to say in order to know the halachas. The truth is, even when it comes to the spiritual secrets of Torah, which obviously they could learn also in the heavenly yeshiva because they're spiritual topics. And you would assume that if you're in the heavenly yeshiva and you're learning secrets of spirituality, you probably understand them way better than we do here on earth. Nevertheless, even in those areas of Torah, we know that the higher realms have to eavesdrop on the lower realms to understand what's really going on. Come from the Bir Likutei Torah from Maimon Chazal. A great example of that is the Alter Rebbe quotes the Gemara that tells us, there was a debate in the heavenly yeshiva. Safek, the whole debate about Baheres, right? A Safek about Tumah, David says it's Tahir, and the rest of the Masifta Dirikia says it's Tumah, the heavenly courts. So what do they say to resolve it? They say which of the sages is available to consult on this. Rabbi Bar Nachmani. They bring Rabbi Bar Nachmani to Paskin. So in the Likutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe explains this is not a straightforward halachic question. It's about a whole spiritual concept that was being debated. And yet, who was going to determine which spiritual perspective is correct? A human. Is because decoding every part of Torah, including the most esoteric parts of Torah, is in the purview of humans. So therefore, the person who's a Yosef Oil, you have to tell him, don't run away into some spiritual reality. There has to be shoiv. Don't just go into the spiritual realms, come back down to earth. But a person is engaged in business, you've got to actually argue the other extreme. This is somebody who is engaged in the physical, is engaged in the modern world. So he has a valid complaint. How can I withstand all of the incredible challenges of trying to be a frum Jew in our physical world? So he could likely arrive at the conclusion, let me escape this world completely. Let me aspire to spirituality, forget about my business, forget about the things I'm engaged with, and become a spiritual person, because it's just too overwhelming, it's too dangerous. So we clarify for this person as the tachlis hakavon is shoiv, that the reason your neshama is in a human body is shoiv, to bring all the spirituality into the world, to make a home for Hashem in the lowest worlds. If that's what the Eibush demands of us, reassure the business person. Whatever the Eibush demands of us, we are capable of fulfilling, because the Eibush doesn't make demands beyond our abilities. That means that Hashem has preloaded into us all of the resources that we need to be able to overcome whatever challenges it is that the world throws at us. Und das ist der Unterschied zwischen die zwei Zivuim, was seine gekommen als die Zoff und Mrs. Shnei Bnei Aharon. And now we can understand that yes, there are two lessons and instructions that follow the deaths of Aaron's sons, but they're completely different sides of the coin. The erste Zivui is the hero for Mrs. Shnei Bnei Aharon to Yoshvei Oil. First instruction: what do people engaged in pure spirituality have to learn from Nadav and Avihu? Don't intoxicate yourself in drink. That is a mitzvah specifically for the kohanim. And from that we extrapolate the law that if a person is intoxicated, they cannot rule on halachic issues. Which is derived from these psukim as well. It's also also originally links back to the kohanim, because the pasuk that says that they will be the ones to instruct, which means to render halachic decisions, actually speaks about kohanim. While the inyan for kohanim is because what is a kohen? Pretty much the idea of a yoshev oil was a daven zayin abgesundet von yonei ha'olam. Kohanim have to be removed from physical things. Huvdulu midarke ha'olam, as the Rambam tells us. They have to be separated from the things of this world. Und abgeben sich in ganzen Avodas Hamikdash, totally dedicated to Avodas Hamikdash. That's why they can't own property, and they don't really earn. They have to rely on the good graces of the community. And every single one of us has a kohen aspect to us. The Rambam Paskint, as the Rambam famously says, so that any person who chooses to separate themselves from the community and dedicate themselves to serve Hashem, and to relieve themselves of all of the pressures and stresses that everybody else has, as in Iskadish Kodesh Kadosh, and that person becomes the holiest of holy. And in this world, the person will have the experience like the Kohanim and Levim. The Eibishter will look after them, and they'll have a spiritual experience. So this person who's so completely invested in spirituality, we say, don't get intoxicated on the wine. Meaning, yayin v'aisif seidas Torah, as we well know, yeino shel Torah, the wine of Torah refers to the secrets of Torah. Nichnas yayin, yotzos seidas, the expression goes, when wine enters, the secrets emerge. Not just the secrets of the person who's drunk, but the secrets of Torah are associated with wine. Und stias yain, was yain at time meant, when you drink wine, wine has a good taste. That implies as man Geschmack im Verstehen die Torah. That implies somebody who gets tremendous value and pleasure out of learning those secrets of Torah. And if them kommt tzivos, so there's an instruction to that person: Yain v'sheichel yain dech shichrusay al teist. Don't get drunk on the wine. As der Inyan hayain the Geschmack und Reingetonenkeit and Yeseides Torah. Yes, of course, you should enjoy and invest in learning the secrets of Torah. Tani bring it samatze von shichrus. But that shouldn't cause you to be drunk. We know what happens when a person is drunk. They're not part of this world. We don't want you to come to a point where you lose your mind, where you lose yourself. Where you're completely engaged in some spiritual, supernatural experience without translating it back down into earth. The Anhaga for Nadav Avihu is given, and that's what Nadav and Avihu did, because they entered the Mikdash intoxicated. Which means, so that means that they engaged with and cleaved to the secrets of Torah in an oifen vasot gepelt to the extent that it wrecked their beings, close and nefesh mamish, and caused their neshamas to expire, to fly out of their bodies. They came so close to Hashem that they died. On the Rebbe, therefore, is gleich noch Aaron, straight after Aaron's sons pass away. Immediately there is an urgent need to address the kind of Jew who is so spiritual, to tell them, the people who are similar to Aaron's sons, don't do what they did. Don't get so engrossed in the spiritual experience that you lose yourself. Because even the most esoteric spiritual parts of Torah were designed for human physical engagement. Keep it real. Okay, that's for the elite, spiritual elite. What about the rest of the Jewish community? Who are engaged with the materialism of this world? Their instruction is, don't go running off into the holy space. Now, at face value, that is an instruction to Aaron and the Kohanim. Specifically Aaron, who's the Kohen Gadol, who's allowed into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, don't go whenever you want. But the message is universal for every Jew. In the same way as whatever happened by the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur in the Beis HaMikdash had an impact on and represented the entire Jewish community. As Chassidus explains, that when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, all the Jews, in a sense, go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Besides the fact that the Kohen Gadol is the representative of the Jewish community, who takes the entire Jewish community, even the least spiritually advanced members of the Jewish community, along for the ride on Yom Kippur, besides that, Yom Kippur obviously speaks to not only the broad Jewish community, but the people who have fallen off the wagon. They need the kapara more than anybody else. If that's true about the whole of Yom Kippur, that it speaks to every single Jew, the specific instruction, don't go into the Mishkan unless it's the right time, As Teichne Shaykh Tziyad Niden also has a message for every Jew, which is Shasas kommt das Mann von Yom Kippurim. Comes Yom Kippur. Wenn der Mann sich auf die alle Inyanim Bild zu was haben sich zu ihm zugeklebt im Meshach Hashana, where a Jew reflects on all the spiritual dirt that accumulated on that person through the course of the year. Was zu dem davon kommt zu Yom Kippurim, was ist Yom Kippur. That's why I need a Yom Kippur. I need the cleansing. And I hope to move El HaKodesh, and I need the Yom Kippur boost to be able to re-enter a space of holiness. The person could say, you know what, Yom Kippur is so powerful, and I am so far away from this, I actually want to capture the Yom Kippur every single day. Person could be inspired on Yom Kippur to say, you know what, that's it, I'm out of here. I'm not engaged in the physical world any further. I want to have a Yom Kippur state all year round. I'm just going to invest in holiness. This is something we have to address, even after we've warned the Yoshvei oil not to overindulge and intoxicate in spirituality. Because if you're telling the Yosef oil, don't get too caught up in spirituality, as a is verstandig. We understand why you've got to do that. We understand why this is an issue for him, because he's going to float away in his spiritual pursuits. He has to be told to come back down to earth. And we understand why it's safe to tell him to do this, because even when the Yosef oil re-enters the earth's atmosphere, it's not going to, like he's going to be contaminated by the things of this world. Even when he's, so to speak, down here on earth, his earth is Torah. And so we have to tell this person, okay, don't run away into the spiritual realms, but you'll be safe even here on earth. But when you're addressing people who are in the business world, they have challenges because they're exposed in the physical world. And you really have to worry that they might falter. Maybe it's actually good advice to say, you know what? Dump your job. Go after Koil. Get involved in spirituality. And therefore we have this unique lesson in this parasha Acharei for these people. Even a person who's engaged in business shouldn't go running to holiness at the wrong times. But the person's going to say, well, what do you want me to do? I'm in the physical world. It's too overwhelming. How am I going to survive? How will I stand up to all of the challenges? We say to the person, you know when we're going to start telling the business person about the fact that he has to engage in the world? Only Pashas Acharei. After we've spoken about the challenges represented by the non-kosher animals, as well as the internal challenges represented by personal impurity. The fact that there's a Torah guidance for these issues in life is that is the instruction and the empowerment of every Jewish person, that you can actually not only not be a victim of the world, but in fact elevate and refine the world. Firstly, that you can manage and even transform the areas around you that are not automatically holy. On side, as well as the internal issues that a person might have. Because this is not just information, but it's information in Torah, and therefore Torah empowers us to be able to make a difference in this world. That gives us the capacity to be able to overcome all of the challenges and not have anything to fear from the world. To the contrary, not only should we not be afraid of the world, but we have the power to transform the world and transform it in the ultimate sense that it becomes Hashem's home. And even let's say that a person chas v'shalom had a mishap along the way, is das not a fisha? You have to know that that's temporary. And in a moment, a person has the power of Yom Kippur and the capacity for tshuva, which turns everything around. Not only turns around, but tshuva takes us to a point that even the greatest tzaddik cannot achieve. And that's reassuring for the person who says, I need to run away from this world because it will swallow me. Don't worry, everything can be fixed. Not only fixed, but elevated even higher. And therefore a person can confidently go down the path of fulfilling the purposeful creation, to make this world a home for Hashem, which will be manifest and apparent with the coming of Mashiach immediately.